Hello, my name is Dale Deerdorf, and what I'd like to do is I'd like to provide you a presentation on a Pracademic approach to project management. Before we get started, one of the first things we need to do is understand some of the new terminology I'm going to be exposing you to. So the first term I want you to really understand is Pracademic. For most of us, I think we've got a pretty good, clear understanding of what an academic approach to something would be. Something that's done through book smarts, something that's done from an educational standpoint that's book written or driven in that approach. In today's modern society, there's a lot of new things happening, simulation-based type of experiences for knowledge. Capture things that are incorporated into learning modules or learning management systems that really start to pull at what I'll call 21st cutting century approaches. A Pracademic approach means a practical application. It's based upon previous experience by knowledge experts, whether those are SMEs, which are subject matter experts in the field, or people who have experienced it before. They've done it before and they can tell you exactly how to approach a problem or a situation or what the best solution might be based upon previous experience. So what I want to do is I want to take I'll call it the umbrella of project management, and I want to just kind of open that up for you from a Pracademic standpoint. And by that, what I want to do is I want to walk you through a new model that's available that I've put together, and it's integrated from a variety of resources. So you'll get to see that. I want to show you the difference between the old model and the new model and how this Pracademic approach really has substance to it, especially in the project management field for you. So let's go ahead and jump in. I want to introduce you to the model first, and it is, in essence, looking at a project in a linear perspective, top to bottom, to show you from a flow what exactly happens. What are the different phases that are accompanying itself through the project? And you can see that these phases overlap each other. There's a connected and an interconnected nature to what's happening here from a project perspective. For those of you that are new to project management, you'll understand that this is I'll call it a real-time approach to what happens to you in a project. For those of you that are experienced project managers or have previous project management experience, you'll look at this and you'll appreciate and understand that yes, these do overlap. Yes, there are areas that as I explain it will make more sense to you. So there are this many project phases, and what I want to do is I want to draw a reference back to what we use typically, which is the PMBOK Guide, the Project Manager's Book of Knowledge. This book lays out for you 5 of these phases in a linear format, and it gives you knowledge areas for each one of these areas. But what I've tried to do is capture for you exactly from your perspective what's important. As a project manager, as you're looking at a project and working from the front to the back, you're going to see that there are specific steps and specific documents or areas that must be worked on as we flow through a project. So let's just take our first peek at it, and I'm going to walk you through the phases. Then at the end of that, I want to walk you through each phase, give you an explanation as to what's covered in each phase, and just try to give you, I'll call it practical experience, a Pracademic's approach to what's happening in a project as we move along. So the first step I always like to do in anything I do is I like to bookend it. So the front end is always called introduction. The back end is going to be called the final phase. So that gives you a good understanding of what we're going to fill into the middle now. So we start with the introduction phase of a project. You can see that that's in the image off to my side in a red color. After that, we go into what's called the initiation phase or the initiating phase. I'll call it the process flows or the things that are accomplished in that initiation phase are umbrellaed in that blue, I'll call it oval or rectangular shape that's identified for you. Then we go in and we plan the project. You have the planning phase. Once the planning is completed, we then run down into the monitoring phase. We set up what the monitoring controls would look like, and then after monitoring, we move into executing the phase. We start execution of the phase and in the project to understand what's happening as we move through and operate in it. Then we've got the controlling phase section Then we go into closing the project, the close phase, and then for you also, I have what I refer to as the final phase. That final phase being the end of the project. So this is a project laid on its side, realistically, top to bottom, and you'll notice that there are two things that run from the top to the bottom off on the sides of most of these boxes. One is quality, and you can see that quality starts in the introduction phase and drives itself all the way down into that final phase. And on the other side, you'll see that I have changes, because from the top of the introduction phase all the way down into that final phase, there are changes that happen on a project. A real-time project is very dynamic, it's fluid, it's moving, and there are constantly changes that are being pulled at you as the project manager. Sometimes they're customer driven, sometimes they're event or situationally driven, sometimes they are driven by process steps that we've got implemented. So let's take a look at that introduction phase and the key components to it. The introduction process group consists of those processes needed prior to the team initiation. These are things that have to be done or should be done prior to initiating the project. The internal and external stakeholders need to formulate the preliminary information required to establish the project. And a lot of times that's done through a project proposal. Many times you're also going to see that you'll get handed a project and you'll say, it hasn't been anointed yet, you're not officially the project manager yet, but I need you to work on it. So you'll see that we've umbrellaed in here the project proposal, the project selection, getting a good kind of, I'll call it a 10,000 foot view or a snapshot of what the project looks like to start with. Then the project resume. That means you have to put together a portfolio of the people that you think are going to work on this project. You have to have at least a bare bones set of names of people that are going to support you. Depending on the type of environment you're working in, whether that's matrix or projectized matrix or a traditional project environment, you're going to have a team of people assigned to you at some level that are going to help you move through this. The other thing you need to understand is that you need to put together a team contract. That team contract gives you the ability to kind of set up what the norms are going to be. What are the expectations for all of those team members as they come on board? And then finally, one of the things that you must do is you should go back and look at best practices from previous projects. You should review those to understand what may have gone wrong, where the gaps might have been in a previous project that may have been close to this one, and from an enterprise standpoint, what are the best practices that we recommend you run the project with. All of this is umbrellaed in the introduction phase. The next phase, the initiation phase or the initiating phase, is where we initiate the project. This is where we officially nominate you or a representative to be the project manager, the PM in charge of this project. And one of the first documents that you will be required to put together is the team charter. To put that team charter together means that you really need to reach out to those stakeholders that are involved. And you have to put a good, clear understanding of what I'll call the original scope statement is. What do we think the scope of the project is? And at least 3 key characteristics that I think you have to have before you can initiate a project. There has to be some level of project schedule. You must have an official start date, stop date, that even if it's an estimation or a WAG, a wild you-know-what guess, that you've put together a good, clear understanding of how long you think this project is going to last. The next piece is going to be an estimation of the cost. It doesn't have to be a full-blown cost yet, but there should be some level of understanding between you and the stakeholders as to how much money we think we're going to spend on this project. And the reason for that is between the schedule and the cost, the third component is going to be quality. I need to understand the fidelity or quality level that we're imposing on this project. Are we building a Volkswagen or are we building a Cadillac would be the best way to put it. Because what you do as the project steps and how you evolve the scope is going to be different depending on what the end item deliverable is in, I'll call it the end item stakeholder or customers idea at the end. So that's the initiation phase, or the initiating phase, and it consists of what we refer to as those processes performed to define the initial project scope. We're going to go into a further development of that scope as it evolves in further steps, but this is the initial project scope, and to obtain what I refer to as the authorization to start. Your stakeholder will look at this statement, this project, this project description, the scope statement, and say, yes, within the team charter description, whether I've got limitations, assumptions, whether I've laid out bare bones information, whatever those milestones are, they agree with this. And that's the start. Now, from there, we're going to move into the planning phase. The planning phase is one that may have seemed like it started when we started the project, because some of that stuff starts to get evolved when we were working on the proposal. As we're floating into the initiation phase, it feels like it's being put together. But the official planning happens in the planning phase. The planning phase, or that planning process group, consists of the processes necessary to complete that scope of effort, to fully develop and give yourself a perspective on exactly what that scope is. It defines the objectives, the milestones. It gives you a good, clear understanding of what we think the project team's goals are going to be as we move through that. And the objects that we put together, or the processes that we use, are typically putting together what I refer to as a WBS, which is a work breakdown structure. Sometimes you will be asked to put an OBS together, which is an organizational breakdown structure based upon resource loading. So there's something called a RACI, R-A-C-I, the resource loading feel to it. So what you're trying to do is get a good, clear understanding of what that scope looks like. I prefer to do a manual version of the WBS first. And the reason for that is that you can lay it out in an Excel spreadsheet and really start to understand what you think the scope is. Get that work breakdown structure put together, and then from there you would start to load that into Microsoft Project as a project schedule, as a bare bones initial project schedule. It'll give you the hierarchical view of what a major, I'll call it, goal is, and then sub goals below that, and all of those should feed down into the end item milestone, which is delivering the project, and it'll give you a flow. Not necessarily the plan, but it'll give you a hierarchical flow of what that project looks like. In addition to that, when we're doing the planning, it's necessary to put together some other plans. The resource loading plan, the procurement plan. You'll start working on a good, firm, I'll call it budget, and really understanding what the project looks like. And as I said before, you can see the quality is driven up and down, especially in the planning phase. This is where we may have to tailor or customize the quality or fidelity of the deliverable. We need to understand that, and constantly there are changes coming through. Some of these changes as they come through are driven by the customer and may need official, I'll call it, authorization from whoever your owner or whoever's in charge of you as a project manager is. You can't just let the customer or the stakeholders drive changes to you. At some point, depending on the fidelity of those changes or the impact of those changes, you may need to go to a CCB, which would be a control change board. The control change board would then get authorization for you and potentially additional funding, or potentially an extension into the scope so that your schedule can kind of move or evolve. You're going to find that these happen in every project. Anyone who's ever worked on a project will tell you that these are the constraints that will make you pull your hair out. It'll drive you crazy, because these are changes that are constantly happening around you. This is where you've really got a firm level of the budget, because you've either done a top-down or a bottoms-up, not only estimate, but you've set yourself up to start the baseline. So this is what we're trying to cover in this particular phase. The next phase we're going to go into is the monitoring phase. How do we monitor the project? And you'll see that we actually umbrella everything from the initiate project all the way down through KPIs. And you can also see that we've covered a lot of what we did in the last series of creating those plans, the initial schedule, putting together the charter, the scope statement. This is where we monitor what's happening within these process groups. So you see the monitoring process consists of the processes required to track and review the performance of the project baseline. This gives us the ability to look and see, once we're done, are we ahead of schedule or behind schedule? Are we over cost or under cost? And there are specific areas that we will cover in an additional phase where we'll look at exactly what those are. Okay? This also gives you the opportunity to really understand the fidelity of areas of change, risk, quality, scope increase, schedule position, and what we refer to as the critical path. And remember that the critical path is just the longest path through the project. What will take the longest for us to finish the project? Now, the next phase I want to go into is the execution phase. This is where we actually start to execute the project. This is where we've done the monitoring above this. Execution is where we're actually capturing, I'll call it project performance. These are the processes necessary to be able to do that, to understand that project scope, project objectives, project specifications, the milestones, and to start to look at it from a baseline perspective and measure CPI, SPI, those are Schedule Performance Index and Cost Performance Index. In addition to that, you may have lag and lead measurements to kind of give you a feel for, if we were to project out, what do we think this is going to cost us in the long run? Have we covered all the big risks? There's a variety of things that happen here, but you're going to see that that project execution is really bare bones based off of creating that cost baseline and then creating earned value, EV, or with some level of earned value management system, the ability to understand where we're at. A baseline is just a point. If we take a look at it, it's just a point on a project that we measure ourselves against. Sometimes that baseline will need to be changed. You cannot just artificially change a baseline on a project. You need customer approval, and typically you need all your stakeholders to approve also. In addition to that, you can see that we're going to umbrella the execution phase or the executing phase all the way down to where we finish the project. So starting from the front end, where we've created the baseline, all the way down to where we finish that project. Now, let's go to the next phase. Our next phase is the controlling phase. We control this project from very high up, almost from the team charter point. Once we've got that scope developed and we finally flow down into executing, you're going to see at that point we control the project. The controlling phases are the processes required to orchestrate the progress and performance of the project. These are the places where we can tweak things. We can make variable changes to either cost, schedule, quality. We can fine-tune risks. We can look at ways to gain opportunities. And from a procurement perspective, the controlling area here is where we must really look at supplier management, controlling that. So control means you're looking at people resources. It means you're looking at, I'll call it supplier management resources. You're looking at everything. You're trying to really get a good feel of it. And you will throttle up and throttle down. You will have to make changes, and those changes flow in and out of the controlling phase. So as you see what we've illustrated here, a lot of that execution phase is covered by the controlling phase, because while you're executing, you continually will need to be able to be making, I'll call it, adaptive changes to the dynamic nature of the project as it continues to evolve. The next piece that I've got for you is the closing phase. For many project managers, they will work on specific areas of a project. Many times the capture team or the proposal team is not the team that works at closing the project. Projects have a duration, and you'll find that many times they will move project managers on and off and replace them depending on what they think your specialty may be. So if you're a project manager and you're working cradle to grave, front to back, and you're covering all of the steps, you have a nuanced understanding of project management that most people don't get. You really have that Pracademic perspective of it. You've seen how we put the project together in the beginning, and you're flowing it down to the back end, which is really, really important. So when we close the project, many times there are project audits that are required. Ultimately, the end item deliverable, that milestone that was written up in the schedule, is presented to the customer along with any official paperwork. That is how we close the project. And many times, getting that final paperwork, getting those final signatures, getting everything lined up is quite extensive. So sometimes closing the project seems very, very hard. I've watched projects run 99.9% complete for months before we were able to finally close it off, depending on what paperwork or what audits may needed to have been completed. In addition to that, you're going to see lessons learned. This is where we need to go ahead and capture lessons learned from the different things that have happened on the project. This is where we get our tribal knowledge. I want to know what tacit and explicit, I'll call it activities, were required. What things went right, what things went wrong, where are gaps, what could we do to possibly improve things? And then we're going to balance that off again against best practices. This is where I want us to take a look at our company best practices or our organizational best practices and say, should any of these be updated? Did something happen on this project that needs to be changed from a best practice perspective so that we can rerun that up to the front end of another project when we go to start another project? So the closing phase consists of I'll call it the processes performed to conclude all activities across all process groups to formally complete the project phase and our contractual obligations. And then finally, we have something once the project's been closed, I call it the final process group. And this final process group, you're going to see, is where we transition our team members off to new projects. This is where we also typically capture or put together, I'll call it a project report, and that project report summarizes at some level or some fidelity what has happened. And in addition to that, there's usually some level of team presentation. That team presentation can be done to a management team. It can be done to just the team members to kind of capture and summarize exactly what happened. And then the final piece that I think is critical for us to do is some level of peer review. That peer review is where we take a look at the people that worked on the project and we gauge their performance, both from a qualitative and a quantitative perspective. We give everyone a ranking and rating to find out who worked best in which areas, who may need additional training, who may be in a position to mentor other people or may need mentoring. Now that's what I refer to as a Pracademic perspective for project management. It walks you completely through a project from front to back, all of the steps necessary, and all of the documentation that I think is required for you to be able to complete that project and present it to your customer. Congratulations and thank you for listening. Goodbye.